The Crusader army faced a daunting challenge in their attempt to take Antioch, as the citadel was located 300 meters above the lower city and would be difficult to capture. To make matters worse, Sion, the governor of the city, had only a small force at his disposal and was unwilling to risk raiding parties against the attackers. As a result, the first 2 weeks of the siege passed with little action as the Crusaders organized their positions. The various contingents led by Norman Bohemond of Taranto, Godfrey of Bouillon, the Duke of Lower Lorraine, and Raymond IV, Count of Toulouse, set up camp outside the main gates of the city, preparing for a long and difficult campaign. The Crusader army, with the exception of Raymond, who favored an immediate assault, preferred to rest their men and possibly wait for reinforcements, particularly from Byzantine Emperor Alexios, who might provide some siege engines. While the Crusaders waited, the defenders of Antioch grew more confident after the period of inactivity and began to send out small sorties to raid the Crusader camps. Additionally, the defenders received word that a Muslim relief army was on its way from Damascus, providing them with further encouragement. The Crusaders knew that they would have to move quickly if they wanted to take the city before the arrival of the relieving force. As winter approached, Bohemond managed to lure the Muslim garrison at Harank out into the open, where they were defeated. Shortly after this victory, a fleet of 13 ships arrived with men, arms, and supplies for the Crusader army. However, the Crusaders were facing a growing problem with food, and they had to forage far and wide to find enough to sustain themselves, exposing themselves to more attacks from the city's defenders. In response, the Crusaders built a tower above Bohemond's camp to provide better cover. The Siege of Antioch was proving to be a difficult and complex campaign, with both sides facing challenges and trying to gain an advantage over the other. As the winter months wore on, the Crusader army found it increasingly necessary to find a better source of food. To this end, a large force led by Bohemond and Robert of Flanders was sent to Hama in search of provisions. Meanwhile, Sion, who had a well-informed spy network, launched an attack on one of the Crusader camps. The raid was repulsed with heavy losses, but the Crusaders also suffered significant casualties, including the death of many knights. The Siege of Antioch was becoming a costly and grueling campaign for both sides. The Crusader army was also facing setbacks elsewhere. While searching for provisions in Hama, Bohemond and Robert of Flanders encountered the Muslim relief force from Damascus, which surrounded Robert's force. Bohemond held back, waiting for the right moment to attack. When the situation looked dire for Robert's force, Bohemond launched a surprise attack on the Muslims and defeated them. However, the Crusaders were forced to return to Antioch without fulfilling their mission to find food. The Siege of Antioch was a complex and multifaceted campaign, and both sides faced challenges and setbacks as they tried to gain an advantage over the other. As the siege wore on, the Crusader army faced increasingly difficult conditions, including weeks of rain and a lack of food that led to starvation and desertion. The army was reduced to just 700 knights. To further demoralize the Christians, the Patriarch of Antioch was displayed in a cage over the city's walls. Meanwhile, the Crusaders resorted to robbing Muslim graves for valuables. The battle for Antioch was turning into a particularly bitter and unpleasant conflict. Both sides were struggling to gain an advantage, and the conditions of the siege were taking a heavy toll on the soldiers. As the Siege of Antioch continued, Bohemond revealed his desire to take and rule the city for himself, ignoring any previous agreements to turn it over to the Byzantine Emperor. He threatened to withdraw from the siege to attend to his lands in Italy unless he was given the right to rule Antioch once captured. The other Crusader commanders did not agree to this, but Bohemond stayed and waited for an opportunity to further his own interests. As the Siege of Antioch continued, Bohemond revealed his desire to take and rule the city for himself, ignoring any previous agreements to turn it over to the Byzantine Emperor. He threatened to withdraw from the siege to attend to his lands in Italy unless he was given the right to rule Antioch once captured. The other Crusader commanders did not agree to this, but Bohemond stayed and waited for an opportunity to further his own interests. Meanwhile, a second Muslim relief force was sent from Aleppo and allied cities, which managed to retake the fortress of Herank. In response, Bohemond led the Crusader knights in an attack on the newcomers, driving them back to Aleppo in retreat. The Siege of Antioch was a complex and multifaceted campaign, with both sides facing challenges and trying to gain an advantage over the other. As the siege continued, the food supply for both sides was not improving. However, the Crusaders received more help in the form of supplies from Cyprus, as well as siege engines and building materials from the Byzantine Emperor via a ship commanded by the Englishman Edgar Atheling. When a group of Crusaders tried to collect these materials, they were ambushed by a Muslim sortie, but reinforcements arrived from the Christian camps and up to 1,500 Turks were killed. Despite these setbacks, the Crusaders were able to keep fighting and continue their efforts to take the city of Antioch. The Crusaders made use of their new materials, building a fortress tower to better attack a fortified bridge still held by the enemy and another tower to cover a major gate that they had not yet managed to block. These access points had allowed the defenders to leave the city and attack the Crusaders or replenish their food supplies. By building these towers, the Crusaders were able to better protect themselves and maintain their efforts to take the city. The Crusaders were able to acquire their own food and trade with local merchants without interference from the defenders, as the risk of sorties had been reduced. This improved their situation, but they received news that a large Muslim army was approaching the city in May, made up of troops from various regions including Mosul, Baghdad, Persia, and Mesopotamia. The arrival of this force could spell disaster for the Crusaders if they were unable to capture the city and use its defenses to protect themselves. The situation was precarious, and the Crusaders had to act quickly to try to secure their position. The leader of the Muslim relief force, Kaboga of Mosul, was hesitant to attack the Crusaders while Edessa was in their hands, as it posed a potential threat to his right flank. This delay gave the Crusaders time to prepare for their final assault on Antioch. While his fellow commanders were unaware, Bohemond was secretly negotiating with a traitor in the city, an Armenian named Firuz, who was willing to betray his loyalty and help the Crusaders. This potentially significant advantage would help the Crusaders in their efforts to take the city. When word reached the Crusaders that Kaboga's army was on the move, many of them decided to flee rather than face defeat in battle. However, their timing was unfortunate, as the very next day Firuz agreed to allow Bohemond and his men access to the city walls under his control. This development could potentially turn the tide in the Crusaders' favor. Bohemond shared his plan with the other Crusader leaders, and they all agreed to pretend to move away from the city in order to meet the approaching Muslim army. However, under the cover of darkness, they would secretly return and attack the western wall of Antioch, where Firuz was waiting to let them in. This surprise attack would give the Crusaders an advantage in their efforts to take the city. The surprise attack on the western wall of Antioch was successful, with Bohemond's knights scaling the walls and capturing the northwest towers without resistance. The rest of the Crusader army was then able to enter the city by opening the gates from the inside. This tactic of using treachery to gain access to the city, rather than trying to break through its fortified walls, had also been used by the Muslims when they captured Antioch in 1085 CE. The First Crusade finally succeeded in capturing Antioch after an 8-month siege, but the victory was marred by violence and chaos. The Crusaders killed many Muslims and Christians in the city, and Yaki Sion fled while his son, Shams ad-Dawla, retreated to the citadel. Despite the bloodshed, the Crusaders had finally achieved a major victory in their quest to recapture the Holy Land. After the fall of Antioch, the Crusaders found themselves in a difficult position as they were now the ones being besieged by a large Muslim army led by Kaboga of Mosul. While the Crusaders were busy looting the lower city, Kaboga set up camp in the same positions that the Crusaders had occupied for months during the siege. Bohemond, who had been trying to take control of Antioch for himself, was wounded while leading an attack on the citadel, which was being held by Yaki Sion's son, Shams ad-Dawla. The situation seemed dire for the Crusaders, as they were surrounded by a much larger enemy force and running low on supplies. The Crusader army had been struggling to hold out against the besieging Muslim forces at Antioch, and the situation was dire. Desperate for reinforcements, the Crusaders waited for a rescue army sent by Byzantine Emperor Alexios. However, a misunderstanding caused a rift between the Crusaders and the Byzantines that would have long-lasting consequences. As the Crusaders fought for survival, tensions mounted and the situation grew increasingly dire. With the Crusaders besieged by a large Muslim army and facing the threat of starvation. In the hope of rescue, they waited for an army sent by the Byzantine Emperor Alexios. However, due to a misunderstanding, Alexios was led to believe that the Crusaders were on the brink of defeat and decided to withdraw rather than waste resources on a lost cause. Additionally, news of another Turkish army heading to intercept him further motivated the decision to retreat. The Crusaders were left to face their challenges alone. As the Crusaders fought for their survival against the overwhelming Muslim forces, a sense of desperation set in. To make matters worse, they received news that the Byzantine Emperor, Alexios, who had promised to send reinforcements, had turned back and was not coming to their aid. This left the Crusaders with few options, and they were forced to rely on their own resources to hold out against the attacking Muslims. Meanwhile, Bohemund, one of the Crusader leaders, became determined to keep Antioch for himself and defy his vow to return the city to the Byzantines, further straining relations between the two groups. Despite suffering heavy losses, the Crusaders managed to repel a major attack by the Muslims on the southwest wall of the city. The situation for the Crusaders was becoming increasingly dire, with food running low and their chances of victory seeming slim. In a last-ditch effort to avoid defeat, the Crusaders tried to negotiate a surrender with Kaboga, offering to retreat from the city in exchange for safe passage. However, Kaboga refused their offer, determined to defeat the Crusaders once and for all. Just when all hope seemed lost, a strange event occurred. A peasant named Peter Bartholomew approached the Crusader leaders with a claim that he had had a vision from St. Andrew. In this vision, Bartholomew was shown the location of one of the holiest relics in Christendom, the lance that had pierced the side of Jesus Christ at the crucifixion. The discovery of the Holy Lance was seen as a sign of divine favor by the Crusaders, who were facing desperate circumstances in their siege of Antioch. According to legend, whoever carried the lance would be able to defeat any opponent, and the news of its discovery spread quickly through the Crusader army. This renewed their sense of purpose and determination to hold onto the city, even though they were surrounded by a much larger Muslim force led by Kaboga. On June 28th, the Crusader army launched a full-scale attack on the Muslim camps, taking advantage of the fact that the opposing army, led by Kaboga, was already struggling to maintain unity and was experiencing high rates of desertion. According to legend, the attack was watched over by a group of ghostly white knights, led by St. George, who appear on the hills above. The attack was ultimately successful. As the Crusader army launched their attack, the Muslim forces panicked and large contingents retreated, as their commanders did not want to continue supporting Kaboga. The forces on the citadel, realizing they were unable to hold out alone, surrendered the following day. This marked the end of the siege and the return of Antioch to Christian control. In December 1098 CE, the Crusader army continued their journey towards Jerusalem, capturing several Syrian port cities along the way. They arrived finally at their ultimate destination on the 7th of June 1099 CE. After a short siege, the city was captured on the 15th of July 1099 CE. Alexios, meanwhile, wanted Antioch back, and he sent a force to attack the city, or at the very least isolate it from the surrounding Crusader-held territories. Bohemund had left though, and returning to Italy, he convinced Pope Paschal II and the French King Philip I that the real threat to the Christian world was the Byzantines. Bohemund and his allies believed that the Byzantine Emperor Alexios I and the Byzantine Church needed to be eliminated, and so they launched an invasion of Byzantium, specifically targeting Albania, in 1107 CE. However, the invasion was unsuccessful, largely due to the fact that Alexios mobilized his best forces to meet the invaders and the Pope withdrew his support of the campaign. As a result, Bohemond was forced to accept subservience to the Byzantine emperor, who allowed him to rule Antioch in Alexios' name. This set the precedent for the division of future captured territories among the crusader leaders. If you enjoyed this video, please remember to like and subscribe.